While a system not unique to the UK, Britain's railways have the distinction of being the oldest operators of push-pull services in the world, with examples of this time-saving method of train turnaround ranging from the innovative though rudimentary mechanical arrangements of the early 1900s to the modern and highly sophisticated computerized technology of the present day. Push-pull, as its name implies, is a system of train operation whereby a consist can be propelled both forward and reverse, with a driving cab available at either end to control the train's acceleration and braking. This cab being either in a secondary locomotive at the rear of the train, known as top and tailing, a dedicated power car at either end in the vein of the Class 43s of the high-speed train and Class 373 Eurostar sets, or a cab control unit, a non-powered vehicle, which is essentially just another trailer carriage, but with a functioning cab integrated into its design. The purpose of the push-pull operation is basically to remove the need for running around locomotives in order for trains to change direction, or for requiring a second locomotive to be attached to the rear of the train in order to pull the consist backwards where runaround facilities are not available, such as at large terminus stations, the need for additional locomotives and time-consuming shunting manoeuvres long being a bugbear of railway companies throughout the history of train travel, with experiments in replacing this method dating back to the infancy of rail technology. The first examples of alternatives to the need to run around trains was to integrate the locomotive and carriage into one unit, these early vehicles, released in the 1840s, being dubbed the rail motor, a self-propelled steam locomotive boiler and running gear built into the body shell of a regular train carriage with full seating. Rail motors coming in two basic variants, as either a passenger carriage with a small steam locomotive attached as a semi-trailer at one end, or a passenger carriage with a fully internal steam locomotive at one end, with the latter type sometimes using vertical boilers as these required less floor space. The rail motor was indeed a cheaper machine to operate, as it removed the need to utilize either one or multiple steam locomotives in order to work a regular passenger service, although limitations as to the size of their boilers meant they were rarely able to haul more than one carriage beyond the coach integrated into their bodies. Therefore, due to their reduced running costs but inability to power long trains, they were ideal for low-capacity branch lines across the UK, where profit margins were often threadbare. The rail motor became a common feature across the British railway network, primarily on the aforementioned low-capacity branch lines, but also on higher-capacity inner-city routes, where the advent of brand-new electric tramways meant the conventional rail system had to compete on frequency of service, a rail motor being able to operate to and from the terminus stations of the branch lines far more times per day than a locomotive and coach. The driving controls of the rail motor in the unpowered driver's vestibule, which would today be known as a cab, using mechanical cables or wires, rodding, and compressed air connecting to the steam power plant, with the driver also being able to control the braking and could even sound the whistle, while the fireman, on top of maintaining the coal supply and general upkeep of the boiler, had to release the brakes due to the braking system requiring steam to create a new vacuum, and the ability to operate the relevant control lever had not been facilitated at the unpowered end of the carriage. Due to the incredible popularity of rail motors in providing seamless operation up and down branch lines, additional capacity was required, and was therefore introduced in the form of a dedicated trailer, which also integrated driving controls into its design and allowed for the running of the rail motor from a separate vehicle, creating the very first example of push-pull train operation in history, although, as mentioned, this went to the very limits of the undersized boiler within the rail motor itself and stunted its performance considerably, meaning it was difficult for these trains to meet the tight schedules required in order to remain competitive with tramways. There were other problems too. The rail motor, aside from being severely underpowered, was also very inflexible, as maintaining the steam power plant of the vehicle essentially required both a locomotive and coach to be out of service, whereas a conventional consist could have either interchangeable coaches or locomotives to operate the train, while due to the presence of the coal store and boiler within the same body shell as the passenger accommodation, the interiors were often smothered in coal dust which was difficult to keep clean. While proposals were made for multi-working rail motors in order to increase their power, the limitations of contemporary technology meant a driver in the unpowered cab could not control two rail motors at one time, requiring the use of two driver and fireman crews to maintain operation of each unit, and therefore, in 1905, the Great Western Railway, after seeing the boundaries of their own rail motor fleet, proposed taking a regular, more powerful steam locomotive and fitting it with the mechanism control systems of the rail motors, while a separate unpowered trailer would be fitted with driving controls in order to operate the locomotive. The result was the auto train, which immediately proved far more successful than the rail motor, as it meant there was no theoretical limit to the number of coaches that could be powered by a single steam engine, with consists often comprising up to 4 carriages, with 2 control cars at either end, while the locomotive was sandwiched in the middle, the non-powered control trailers being christened auto coaches or auto trailers. The successful trials and introduction of auto trains on both rural branches and suburban routes in West London to destinations such as Greenford, meaning rail motors fell rapidly out of favour, with all 99 of the Great Western's examples being withdrawn by 1935, of which several were converted for use as auto trailers by having all their steam gear removed. The introduction of auto trains was nothing short of revolutionary, as their ability to marry the power of a regular mainline steam train with the flexible operation of a tram meant housing developers during the interwar years requested new halts and stations be built on outer suburban branch lines in West London to allow passengers use of the auto train in order to reach central London, creating brand new high-capacity, high-frequency commuter corridors and pushing up the profits of the Great Western, their success leading to other railway companies, including the North Eastern Railway, the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway, the Midland Railway and the Great Central, introducing similar rolling stock from 1905, which used either a compressed air method of control or a cable and pulley mechanism. In the end, 256 auto trailers were outshopped from the Swindon works by the time production ended in 1954, the original units, designed by engineer Charles Collett, being replaced in 1928 by an updated series that remained in production well after nationalisation 20 years later, while throughout the decades a variety of steam locomotive classes were modified for auto train operation, perhaps the most famous being the GWR 1400 class 042 tank engines, of which 75 were built between 1932 and 1936 and put to work on auto trains across the Great Western network, and were affectionately dubbed auto tanks. In the end, as the newly formed British Railways pushed for the replacement of steam by diesel and electric traction, the advent of diesel multiple units quickly swept in to succeed steam-powered auto trains, and by the 1960s these services were facing severe decline across the entire of the Great Western's former territory, the last use of an auto train being the Cholford Auto Car on October 31, 1964, running between Gloucester Central and Cholford in Gloucestershire, bringing what appeared to be the end of push-pull operations on the UK rail network. This didn't last long though, as in September of the same year, the southern region were authorised by the then Minister of Transport, Ernest Marples, to electrify the 90-mile main line from Basingstoke to the port town of Southampton and the major resort of Bournemouth at a cost of £15 million, this scheme including a number of branch lines such as the Brockenhurst to Lymington route, but leaving the remaining 60 miles between Bournemouth and the harbour town of Weymouth out of the overall scheme due to cost constraints, thus requiring the use of an alternative means of traction so as to avoid the need for running through trains under diesel traction for the entire 168-mile journey between London Waterloo and Weymouth, while also removing the possibility of requiring time-consuming locomotive run-rounds at either end. The solution came in the form of push-pull operations, whereby a 4-car non-powered train set would be propelled by 4 rep electric multiple units in either an 8 or 12-car formation from London Waterloo to Bournemouth, whereupon the set would be coupled onto a waiting diesel locomotive at Bournemouth Station, usually a Class 33, which would take the train forward into non-electrified territory, while return workings from Weymouth would have the diesel propelling the non-powered coaching stock in push-pull operation back to Bournemouth, where it would be coupled onto a waiting 4 rep, which would haul the service to London Waterloo. The resultant TC, or trailer control, entered service in 1966 alongside its 4 rep counterparts, although rather than being simply a non-powered variant of the 4 rep design, the stock utilised converted Mark I loco-hauled coaches, which had been made redundant on other services due to the influx of the brand new Mark II of 1964, with 28 4-car or 4TC and 3-car or 3TC trailer units, together with 2 spare vehicles, being produced, with conversions being undertaken at York, while prototypes for the testing of the push-pull equipment was undertaken at Eastleigh Works outside Southampton. The push-pull technology, unlike the previous mechanical systems of the Great Western's auto trains, utilising a multi-working cable system, which had been introduced on early diesel and electric locomotives in order to allow for double heading on heavy freight trains. With the cable system having replaced mechanical predecessors as a far more efficient means of controlling the operation of trains via cab cars, further applications of push-pull technology were proposed during the 1970s, owed in part to the motorway building boom of the previous decade, as with the drive to provide greater infrastructure for the exponential rise in car-orientated travel, new motorway routes were constructed to connect the major regional centres of the nation, and thereby drew more people away from the railways than ever before, with passenger numbers for rail operations dropping year on year, while train services were hamstrung with outdated infrastructure and tired rolling stock which, even with the introduction of diesels and electrics, operated in a manner not too dissimilar to the practices used 100 years before, when the railways had an essential monopoly on transport. One of the more notable areas where the railways were losing out was on the prime commuter corridor between Edinburgh and Glasgow in Scotland, with the partial opening of the M8 motorway in 1965, seeing a noticeable drop in passenger numbers on this vital route between Scotland's capital and its second city, many of BR's problems with this service being due to the need for multiple locomotives and complex shunting manoeuvres at either end of the route, with a run round at Edinburgh Waverley in the east, and the use of a second locomotive to draw the consist out of Glasgow Queen Street in the west, as the station was a dead-end terminus, locomotives travelling down to Queen Street from the expansive Springburn depot also taking up their own share of the limited capacity due to the two-track approach to the station. While top and tailing had been introduced from 1971 on the Edinburgh to Glasgow run, with pairs of Class 27 locomotives being put at either end of the consist to both provide improved acceleration and to avoid the need for either running around or additional locomotive shunting diagrams between depots and stations, it was deemed far more efficient to have a single modified Class 47 haul more modern variants of the Mark II coach and the brand new Mark III coach, while 9 Mark II brake standard opens would be fitted with a driving cab next to the passenger gangway in order to create a cab control car, these coaches being dubbed the Driving Brake Standard Open or DBSO. Entering service on both the primary run between Edinburgh and Glasgow, as well as the longer distance intercity route to Aberdeen, with the DBSO usually being positioned at the Glasgow end, the success of introducing these new forms of coaching stock, in addition to the time and cost savings made by way of using an existing design, meant proposals were made by British Rail to convert more Mark II-based DBSOs, as well as potentially introducing a Mark III version of the cab control car, as per the 24 examples utilised with the Irish Railways, on suburban services out of Dublin Connolly. However, tragedy struck on July 30th, 1984, when just after departing Linlithgow station and accelerating back to the line speed of 85 miles an hour, the 1730 Edinburgh to Glasgow, led by DBSO number 9706, struck a 1,000-pound air shakao that had wandered onto the line near Polmont. Delays in the control mechanism between the DBSO and the Class 47 locomotive propelling the stock, an inbuilt feature used to prevent a sudden backlash in the carriages as the engine slowed down, meaning the train had barely begun to decelerate by the time it hit the animal, with what is believed to have been a leg bone becoming trapped under the leading bogie that lifted the carriage clean off the track and causing the consist to pile up in a massive derailment, killing 13 and injuring 61, most of whom were in the DBSO. Following the investigation, a major factor in the severity of what would otherwise have been a minor incident came down to the fact that the DBSO, as a carriage rather than a heavy locomotive, was of such low weight that it was easily driven off the tracks by the cow's carcass, and thus it was decided that, for future railway designs, especially if they required the use of a cab control car, no passenger accommodation would be provided in the lead vehicle if it was regularly operating at speeds over 100 miles an hour, meaning new generations of cab control cars would instead be repurposed as glorified luggage vans, as was the case with the Class 489 cab cars of the Gatwick Express, which were introduced in 1984 using former Class 414 driving motors in tandem with Class 73 electro diesels and converted Mark II coaching stock, the Class 489s and their loco-hauled rakes working this airport transfer service until 2005 when they were replaced by Class 460 Juniper units. In the end, a further 4 DBSOs were converted following the Polmont derailment, before all examples, upon the introduction of Class 158 Express Sprinters in 1990, were withdrawn from the primary Edinburgh to Glasgow run, instead being transferred en masse to the newly electrified Great Eastern Main Line between London Liverpool Street, Norwich and Ipswich, working alongside Class 86 electric locomotives on 100-mile-an-hour expresses between the capital and Anglia, while the 3TC and 4TC push-pull sets, later designated Class 438s, were withdrawn in 1989 following the extension of the electric network from Bournemouth to Weymouth the previous year, with Class 442 Wessex Electrics taking over on Waterloo to Weymouth expresses, a majority of these sets being scrapped, although 2 complete units and several individual vehicles remain in preservation, with one set, 8028, being used on the London Underground subsurface network for specials in combination with either preserved Metropolitan Line steam locomotives or the electric locomotive No. 12 Sarah Siddons. Despite the setback of the Polmont derailment, push-pull technology continued to be developed, with perhaps the most notable examples of its use in the UK taking place towards the end of the 1980s on the West Coast and East Coast main lines, with specially designed high-speed variants which would come to fruition as the driving van trailer or DVT, these being based on the body shells and frames of the pre-existing Mark III coach and the upcoming Mark IV coach of the brand new Intercity 225 sets, the DVTs utilizing a computerized time division multiplexing system in order to communicate with the driving locomotive, the TDM using control signals that are encoded and multiplexed onto the cables by the TDM equipment in the DVT itself, before being demultiplexed by TDM equipment built into the locomotives, allowing them control of the locomotive's regulator, while the air braking system is operated directly from whichever cab the driver is leading the train from. The Mark III DVT came first, and was developed in order to solve a long-standing logistical problem at the terminus stations of the West Coast Main Line, which required the use of multiple locomotives in order to draw trains out of the dead-end platforms of stations such as London Euston, Manchester Piccadilly, Liverpool Lime Street and Glasgow Central, the Mark III DVTs being built by British Rail Engineering Limited at their Derby Litchurch Lane works, and were capable of travelling at 125 miles an hour while being propelled by either Class 86s, 87s or brand new Class 90s. In total, 52 Mark III DVTs were introduced by the time production ended in 1989, these units being placed into service from the same year, and were usually found at the London end of the train, the use of DVTs revolutionising intercity services on the West Coast Main Line by dramatically simplifying the operation of top expresses between London and Glasgow, spelling the end for many first-generation electric locomotives such as the Class 81, 82 and 83, which had been kept in commission simply to work the vast empty coaching stock diagrams between the terminus stations and the carriage sidings. The Mark IV DVTs followed a year later in 1990, and were created as part of the Intercity 225 project, which in itself was a development of the ill-fated Advanced Passenger Train or APT of the early 1980s, and proposed, as one of its considerations for a service fleet, had the experimental tilting train ever reached commercial operation, the formation of a 9-car express train powered by a locomotive and trailed by a cab-controlled DVT, this idea coming alongside other formation proposals for 2 power cars at either end, like the Ice Train of Germany, or for a dedicated multiple unit, which was more refined than the prototype APT used on the West Coast Main Line between 1979 and 1986. Unlike the Mark IIIs, the Mark IV DVTs were built alongside their Intercity 225 sets at the Metro Camel factory in Washwood Heath near Birmingham, and were stylistically different to match the profile of the Mark IV coach and the frontal design of the Class 91 electric locomotives that would power the 9-car sets. Although due to various teething problems and delays in construction for the coaching stock, Class 91s entered service on the newly electrified East Coast Main Line to Leeds and Edinburgh with Mark III trailers from the high-speed train, while Class 43 power cars, modified to have their lower balancing replaced by regular bell and hook couplings, acted as proxy DVTs from 1989 to late 1990, before finally seeing the entry of Mark IV DVTs into service with their corresponding train sets. As per the outcomes of the Polmont derailment nearly a decade earlier, both variants of the DVT did not accommodate passenger seating, their largely empty interiors being used instead to carry bicycles, oversized luggage, and some mail and parcels items under the Red Star postal scheme, although with the privatisation of British Rail in the mid to late 1990s, there was a general loosening of this stringent rule, and thus many brand new high-speed multiple units, such as the Class 180, the Class 220 and 221 Voyager units, the similarly built Class 222 Meridian sets, and the Class 390 Pendolino tilting trains, allowed for the accommodation of passengers in the leading coaches, despite the fact that these trains operated up to 125 miles an hour in regular service. The DVTs, much like the DBSOs however, did also have their fair share of tragedy, as while one example was damaged in the Hatfield crash of October 2000, on February 28, 2001, DVT number 82221, leading a southbound GNER express from Newcastle to London King's Cross, struck a Land Rover Defender, hauling a trailer on which was sat a Renault Savannah estate car, that had accidentally driven down the embankment from the M62 motorway at Great Heck near Selby in Yorkshire, and was stuck on the main line in the DVT's path, causing the train to derail and slam head-on into a Freightliner Class 66, hauling a loaded coal train in the opposite direction. The approximate 142-mile-an-hour closing speed of the 2 trains at the time of the collision completely obliterating the lightweight DVT in a disaster that would claim 10 lives. Regardless of the Great Heck crash, use of the DVTs continued, and they maintained a vital role working both on their home grounds of the East and West Coast main lines, but also on various other routes once they were withdrawn, following an influx of brand new units to replace locomotive and stock formations. West Coast main line use for the Mark III DVTs ending in 2005, once full distribution of the Class 390 Pendolino tilting trains had been completed, although redundant units saw work primarily on the Great Eastern Main Line out of London Liverpool Street, replacing the DBSOs from 2004, before they themselves were withdrawn in March 2020 upon the introduction of Class 745 EMUs, though Mark III DVTs continue to find regular work with Chiltern Railways on their Premier service between London Marylebone and Birmingham, as well as with Network Rail test trains and the DB Cargo UK company train. While 10 Mark IV sets remain at work with LNER on the East Coast Main Line, with the introduction of Class 800 and 801 multiple units from 2019, a majority of the former Intercity 225 sets have been withdrawn and sent for scrapping, although further use of several examples has been found in the ranks of Transport for Wales, which took on 3 DVTs and 4-car Mark IV rakes for use on their own Premier service between Holyhead and Cardiff, although further proposals to reuse Mark IV coaching stock and DVTs on operations such as Grand Central's London to Blackpool service and Grand Union's London to Cardiff service unfortunately fell through. DBSOs, meanwhile, remained in service with Anglia Railways and later One Anglia until December 2006, after which they were replaced by redundant Mark III DVTs from the West Coast Main Line, although these too found a new life with other operators, including Network Rail for use on test trains, and short-lived work with DRS, running worker specials along the Cumbrian coastline to the Sellafield nuclear facility, while DBSO 9712 was sold to the Northern Ireland Railways as part of a proposed push-pull operation in tandem with former Gatwick Express coaching stock and 111 class diesel locomotives, although this scheme ultimately failed to materialise, and the coach is now preserved at the Downpatrick and County Down Railway. However, while the drive of UK train operators towards a more multiple unit-based system has seen the likes of the DVT and the DBSO pushed nearly to extinction, a place can still be found for push-pull operations on the modern British Railway network, as is the case with the brand new Mark V-A coach and its dedicated driving trailers. These 5-car sets being built by CAF at their Bezain factory in northern Spain and are used solely by Trans-Pennine Express on the Nova 3 service between Liverpool Lime Street and Scarborough and later Manchester Airport to Redcar Central. The sets capable of 125 miles an hour and being propelled by Class 68 diesel locomotives subleased from DRS. Overall, the push-pull operations of the British Railway network proved once to be an integral part of cutting down the cost and complexity of shunting manoeuvres and multiple locomotives by adding an air of flexibility to a wide range of services, including top-line intercity express trains on the West and East Coast Main Line, as well as the high-density commuter routes of the Great Western's outer suburban London branch lines, proving to still find a useful place in the modern railway system even after the mass introduction of multiple units.